This will be a partial review of The Secret Loves of Geek Girls, an anthology novel that was crowdfunded by Hope Nicholson in 2015. The novel features a ton of content by loads of female writers and visual artists. There's over 50 prose stories and short sequential artworks. I was originally under the impression that the majority of the novel was going to be composed of comics, but prose was inked onto most of the pages, much to my surprise. I also wanted to cover each story individually, but since there are over 50 stories, I can't very well do that without both spoiling all of the short stories and taking up far too much of your time. Instead, I'll be talking about 8 of the segments that I want to highlight the most, primarily the short comic segments. So here's the first story I'll be looking at, and it's called Shipping by Jen Woodall. Shipping is a short comic about Jen Woodall's childhood obsession with Final Fantasy VII, specifically the relationship between Cloud and Aerith. I also replay the game often, and the game took up a profound amount of my time as a teenager. Woodall's main focus for the comic is how much she projected onto the game, namely in the contempt that she had for Tifa, the rival for Cloud's affections. According to Woodall, she felt insecure in the face of Tifa, a character who is presented as extraordinarily sexy, but she felt more comfortable identifying with Aerith, who has a more modest presentation. Aside from finding the story instantly relatable due to my familiarity with the subject matter, I was also very fond of Woodall's coloring style. She uses various digital brushes, I assume, to add some character to her color fills, which I find a lot more interesting than the hard brush shadows and highlights I normally see on digital comic art. The next story is A Divorcee's Guide to the Apocalypse. This is a prose story by Katie West. Katie details the end of her marriage by using apocalyptic survival techniques as a metaphoric rhetorical device. Her point at the end subverts some degree of what she spends the first half elaborating on, as she concludes that mere survival is not enough for anyone. One thing I find interesting about the divide in worldviews between, say, social liberals and social conservatives is how they handle fictional depictions of modern civilization crashing into oblivion. Social conservatives, generally, if they happen to be religious, usually have an apocalypse story built right into their worldview, and such events are rarely seen as unfortunate, but still a harrowing experience. Social conservatives that aren't religious usually uphold secular doomsdays such as the zombie uprising or collapse of the modern economy as a sword of Damocles that justifies their retrograde, patriarchal worldviews, just in case they come in handy on an acid rainy day. Social liberals, on the other hand, often view these fictional scenarios as what they are, lies that can serve to tell us the truth about how to find personal conviction when the entire context of the world around us has changed. Katie West gives some great advice here when it comes to preparing for the end of your relationships, and considering that every single one of them is going to end eventually, it'll pay to lend her your ear. Moving on to Bemused from Roberta Gregory. Roberta Gregory has been drawing and writing comics for over 4 decades, and it's nice that this short comic provides a little bit of her history, as well as mentions of some very obscure comic publications and zines. I'm a sucker for that kind of ethnographic look into comics culture, even if it is presented from the narrow focus of Gregory's mutual obsession with creative muses of her own imagination. Much of this one just has to be read and seen. It communicates its ideas perfectly and has a wide variety of character designs as the imaginary muses begin to show up. Now on to one of my favorite stories from this anthology. Yes, No, Maybe, from Megan Kearney. I really like this short comic about Kearney's angst, about vulnerability, and her sexuality. It has a limited purple color palette, and all of the expressions that her character goes through are entertaining. I also enjoyed how often her hairstyle and clothing changed during the course of her life. The crux of the story is about how finding out that there are others like you, in this case, those with a sex drive that doesn't quite match what is often expected from wider society, and how this can be a huge relief to anxieties and allow us to open up. Megan Kearney is very clear and an effective communicator, which is why she'll be appearing on this list again. On to Fanfiction F/F Angst from Teenie Howard, and this is a prose story. Teenie Howard's story looks at some of the negative aspects of fanfiction and the effects that the transformative medium had on her early life. The cultural perspectives on fanfiction are intertwined with a story about a very early relationship with a close friend of hers, one that was ambiguously platonic and romantic in phases. Based on my interpretation of the story, it seems that one of the more damaging aspects of being an avid fanfiction writer for Howard was the projection involved in the process. Characters' sexualities and intentions are commonly changed and experimented with in fanfiction, and this departure from canon could be seen as projection if, say, done to a real person. The painful ending of this story seems to reflect on the painful gap between what we want from people and what they may want or expect from us. And the ending is a gut puncher, honestly. The next story is They Bury You in White, from Laura Newbert. Newbert's comic focuses on her high anxiety about the finality of love and marriage, based on the way she viewed the topic through the lens of fiction. Her worries can be summed up as a looming fear that settling down into a wife role would be the last thing that ever happens to her, because stories about inguine protagonists always ended on that note. If she were not married off by the end of the story, you'd become the witch that serves as a villain in the next story. Newbert does give some exceptions to this literary trope, and I appreciate that Miss Brisby of the Secret of Nim film is noted as a very strong female character who is also a single mother. Newbert finds solace in Jane Eyre, and you'll just have to read the entire anthology to find out the rest. Now we have None the Wiser from Diana Knock. On a similar note to fanfiction, F/F, Angst, this short comic also focuses on how painful it can be when someone you desire doesn't live up to a version of them that's built up in your own head. The artwork features cross-hatching and has a very masterful pencil-drawn look. Not much happens in it that can't be described by my first sentence, so I'll let this be a short overview. I guess once again you'll just have to read the book to discover it. Hint, hint. And lastly, Regards to the Goblin King, and R.I.P. to David Bowie. This is a second story from Megan Kearney, and the colors were done by Jordi Belair. Megan Kearney returns to the list, this time talking about the conflicting messages about how desirable and appealing male figures are presented in female-centered media, and how a person would actually want an actual attraction and possible relationship to play out. As a dude, and I really didn't want to start a sentence that way in this book review about a largely by women, for women book, but here we go. So, I'm a dude who's had conversations with frustrated guys about the supposed gap between the bad boy that women desire and the nice guy that they should need. Anyway, I have always said that these bad boy figures are appealing because they're fictional, and no one has to deal with the shitty sides in real life. Kearney posits a more interesting observation than mine in this story. As to not spoil it, I won't reveal her conclusion here, and you'll have to buy the book. So, since I've said that 3 times, I think it's time to wrap this review up, so you can actually go ahead and buy the damn thing already. So I've covered 8 stories that I rather liked, but there are the odd few that demonstrated a few strange things that put me off, mainly one about how video game NPCs should have customizable sexuality and romance option games, and something about that seems creepy in certain contexts, not wrong on its face, but kind of off-putting in a game with a set canon and lore, you know? But anyway, there's also the inclusion of a few webcomics in the book apropos of nothing, honestly. The amount of pages presented doesn't lead to a clear conclusion in some of these, with the exception of Danielle Corsetto's entries. Those made sense in the anthology, but a couple of the other webcomics just seemed like a sample of a few pages, not really fitting the format or the subject matter about romance. Otherwise, I did enjoy my read and would suggest that everyone pop over to buy a print or digital copy. All the links that'll lead you to all of the authors and artists, as well as the book itself, are going to be in the underbar. So, later.